grandmother, which may seem like something I'm just throwing at you out of the blue at the moment, her name was Beagle Eyes. And just remember that and keep it in your somewhere for later on in the story, right? But their married names were Dusha and Yannick Ehrenreich, and on the 9th of March 1939, they gave birth to their one and only son called Henrik Ehrenreich. At that time, there were 60,000 people in Krakow, of whom a third were Jewish. Yannick and Dusha were married in March 1938 and were very lucky as they came from a relatively wealthy and middle-class home. Both had tertiary education and were from traditional Jewish families. They spoke Polish but understood Yiddish. When the war broke out, Henry's father was an import-exporter and had 20 barges on the Vistula, full of rice and sugar, and of course many trucks used for transporting these goods once on shore. Dusha Mala was the youngest of 5 children, of only whom 3 survived the Holocaust. And Yannick was the oldest of 4 siblings, of whom 3 survived and came to live in Israel. The family owned a 4-story 19th century building on Josefa Sarego 18 in Krakow, near Kazimierz, which was the Jewish quarter. They had, the parents, Henry's parents, had a 3-bedroom apartment on the 2nd floor. It's in September 39, when Henry was 6 months old, the Germans invaded and the Krakow Jews had to report for forced labor and to wear armbands. The family decided that they'd better flee. So with trucks laden with goods and furniture, they fled to Lvov, 320 miles east of Krakow, now in the Ukraine. Before getting very far, the German roadblocks confiscated everything. They were simply left with what they were standing in, but they made it to freedom. The whole family lived in 2 tiny apartments. All money was spent on food and rent. In April 1940, the Russians deported 200,000 Jews to Russia, Tajikistan, Siberia, as slave laborers. Henry's father, being the oldest of the family, decided that he was not going to go with them, but he'd better stay behind so that he could send them parcels of food. So he kept fleeing and hiding from place to place. Henry and his mother were very blonde, and they looked and could pass as Aryans. So Henry's mother got counterfeit Aryan papers, and she became Zosha Zrabinski. She worked in a railway kitchen, which helped because sometimes she could stuff things down her bra and bring extra food home. They went back to Krakow, and in the apartment where Henry's parents had lived, now lived their chauffeur, Yannick Leginovitz, and his family. And he said that he would take Henry in and look after him so that Henry's mother, Dusha, could go out and work. So for 6 months, he stayed there in his parents' apartment with the Leginoviches. But then Yannick Leginovich said to Dusha, look, there's rumors going around that we're hiding a Jewish child in the building, and I think we have to move him from here very quickly. So this, of course, horrified Dusha, but Yannick took her and Henrik in a taxi or tram or something or other to the other side of Krakow, and they met a family of 2 ladies, a mother and her spinster daughter. Their names were Mamachka and Jadwiga Gabauer. Meanwhile, in June 1941, Henry's father had been sent to the Janowska labor camp. They managed to go by train, Dusha and Henry, a couple of times and visit. And Dusha organized for Yannick to escape. they were quite wealthy, and she had quite a few diamonds, and she bribed everybody here, there, and the other. And they managed to get Henry's dad into a coffin and bring him out of the labor camp, and they were going to escape. But a terrible thing happened when he got out of the coffin. He said, I can't go with you. I've contacted typhus. I'm very, very ill. I have to stay here and get medicine and liquids. And if I came with you, we'd be caught because I wouldn't survive very long. So the horrible thing is that back he went into the coffin and was taken back into the labor camp, where he died a month later. That left Dusha and Henrik. And they went and took Henrik to Mamchka and her daughter, Jadwiga, and asked would they look after Henry so she could go and do some work. And they said, oh, look, we don't know. We have to speak to our priest. So the two ladies went to speak to their priest, who was in the church in the Wawel in Krakow. And the priest, which wasn't known to us then, but we found out later, happened to be the gentleman who would become Pope John Paul the 23rd. And he was a very, very good man. And he said to the two ladies, you must try and save an innocent child. And that's how Henry came to live with them. He was very loved by them. They looked after him. He didn't have anyone to play with. He was never allowed to take his trousers off. And he had one little boy who came and played with him from next door, who was a Down syndrome boy. And what Henry told me they used to love doing was when there was a truck full of manure that came for the vegetable garden that the two ladies had, they would roll up balls of manure and throw them at each other. He remembered that very well. And he loved going to church with the family. The family were very religious. He became a very strict Catholic and loved the wafers. And that was life at the time. He had visits from his mum. She stole food from the railway kitchen, which I told you, she stuffed down her bra, and she told Henrik she was his aunt. There were no toys, so he played with pots and pans. And if he was naughty, he was sent to the cellar. And he told me he could remember the rats crawling over his shoes. In 1945, Poland was liberated. It had been 3 years that Henry had been staying with Mamchka and Jadwiga. The ladies wanted desperately to keep him. They'd become very attached to him. But Dusha brought her brother, the lawyer, and with certificates and papers, they said, you have to give him back to us. He belongs to us. And very sadly, they parted. After the war, people slowly returned to Krakow. Of course, Henry's father couldn't return. He had passed away. Henry lived with his mother and the Leginoviches in what was hers and her husband's apartment. And Henry went to school and started grades 1 and 2 in 1945 and 46. Dusha's brother had been hidden for 5 years underground. He had a farm and the peasants hid him under the barn, and they hadn't seen sunlight for 5 years. And he had family in Australia, his wife's family, and they decided they were going to go to Australia. Many of the family moved to Israel. Mother's mother's brother, Dunek, moved to Australia with his wife's family. And Dola and Artek, who had gone up to Russia, Dola was Zosha's sister, came back, and they had a little boy, Alex, Henry's cousin, and they met. So there was something of some family left there, but it was great poverty at the time. And life in Krakow was very, very difficult under communism. It was hard to find work. And Dusha went from being a woman of luxury to earning her living on the black market. She would go to Sofia in Bulgaria and bring back nylon stockings and sell them on the black market in Krakow. After the war, many people came back to Krakow looking for family that had survived. A man called Josef Bigeleisen, remember the name Bigeleisen? I told you that was Henry's mum's maiden name, came knocking on the door. He was born in August 1900 and he was a distant cousin. And he'd heard that Dusha lived there. He knocked on the door and she recognised the name, although she didn't recognise him. And Josef Bigeleisen had lived with his wife and young child in Tarnov, and they went out looking for food. And when he came back, he saw his family lined up with 90 other people in the town square, and they were shot before his eyes. His whole family was murdered as a reprisal to somebody who'd done something to a German, and therefore they took 100 of the first people they could get and shot them all. He was absolutely devastated, a broken man, and he came just looking for the remnants of his family. During the war, Joseph had fled and joined a Jewish partisan group, had a very hard life, starving and eating berries whilst on the run. But he and Dusha found comfort in each other, and they married on the 12th of March 1946. And Joseph adopted Henry, and his name therefore changed from Ehrenreich to Bigeleisen. He became Henrik Bigeleisen. Life was very, very bad and hard. And Joseph was an engineer, but he couldn't find any work, so he had to dig the roads and help doing things like that. In the summer of 1946, late at night, there was a mad banging on the door of where they lived. And a bleeding man was on his knees at the front door. And Dusha, Henry's mother, recognised him and brought him in. He was one of the members of their smuggling gang, the ones that got the blackmail stockings and could sell them on the black market, black market stockings, and could sell. And he said, look, the police have discovered us. They know everybody that's in the group. And if you stay here, you will be all taken to prison. So they patched him up as best they could, and he left. And by early morning, both Joseph and Ida, Dusha, were on their way and on a train to Stockholm. Thence followed 2 years in Sweden. A new life. Joseph found work and helped invent an industrial thermometer, for which the owner of the company was very grateful and offered him a partnership. But Dusha didn't want to stay in Sweden. She had a brother and a sister. She'd lost a husband beforehand, although she had a wonderful new husband. She wanted to be with her family. So Dusha and her sister both thought if they could possibly get visas to Australia, where Dunek was, that's where they wanted to go. The joint arranged a flight to Australia from Paris in August 1948 in a converted American DC-3 plane, which left Paris for Sydney via Tehran and Darwin. But nothing goes smoothly, and the pilot sort of ran out of petrol over Basra, and he had to land. Now, if you know your history, at that stage, in 1940, late 1948, early 1949, the War of Independence was on, and Iraq was an enemy of Israel. So immediately the plane landed, and they saw that all the inhabitants of the plane, all the passengers were Jewish. They were immediately became prisoners of war. The men were separated from the women, and the situation was very daunting and uncertain, and the atmosphere was tense at all times. Henrik's mum came to the rescue again. She asked a passenger who was leaving on another plane to please take a letter and to post it as a matter of life and death. The letter was to her brother, Dunek, who by then was settled in Australia, who had very close friends in the Pentagon. They had been in Iraq 3 weeks when a miracle happened. A large military helicopter bearing US insignia and an American flag landed, and a decorated officer and 5 armed American soldiers disembarked. Henry's mum's brother in Oz had received the letter, contacted his friend in the Pentagon, and this was the result. Arguments flew. The American officer stood his ground and said that if the plane was not allowed to leave with its passengers within 24 hours, Iraq would find itself at war with the United States of America. The next morning, they were cleared to leave. Next stop, Australia. They landed in Darwin on the 18th of September, 1948. All was new. All was different, and life was very hard. Joseph worked at digging in the roads and had several heart attacks. They met brilliant, helpful doctors who gave of their time and caring to the couple who were very poor because their illnesses prevented them from working as hard as they would have liked. Henry was bar mitzvahed in 1952. Dusha had brought her sewing machine with her from Sweden, and with it she opened a business called Fable Lingerie. But she became very ill with scleroderma and couldn't use her hands. Joseph died of a heart attack in March 1956, aged 56, and Dusha died in late 1967, also aged 56. From the doctors that treated his parents with such kindness and giving, Henry knew what he wanted to do with his life, to help other people stay healthy. Henry worked very hard at school, but his name was a bugbear. In Australia, beagle-eyes and became beetlebum, bugglebigs, bugglebugs, and he had great difficulty. The Australians couldn't pronounce his name and they teased him mercilessly. So in his last year of high school, he changed it by deed poll to Briggs. That's where we get to Henry Briggs, the name of a famous Australian cricketer. Henry became a brilliant and admired physician. He kept learning and changing. So he then became, from a physician, he became a heart specialist, and finally at the age of 70 passed a major exam in his life to become an anti-aging and wellness doctor. Along the way, he joined Beitar and met a noisy, black, curly-headed girl to whom he took a fancy, and the rest is history. 3 of our 4 children made Aliyah, and in 2003, we bought a home in Renana and decided to spend 4 months of every year here in Israel. The rest of the year, Henry worked in Australia. At the end of 2017, we farewelled our kids and flew back to Oz, Australia. And within a month, Henry had passed away from pancreatic cancer. All our children, grandchildren, and 1 great-grandson were with us in Sydney for the last 3 weeks. And I cannot speak highly enough of their blessed loving and caring. We needed no one else. They were wonderful. Henry was buried here in Renana on the 23rd of Tevet 2 years ago, and I have made my home here permanently ever since. I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to be with my wonderful family, and I thank God for Henry's life and the life he managed to give me. Thank you.
Thank you, Savta. Miriam, can you hear me?